You see that skyscraper downtown? The one that scrapes the clouds with its spire of glass and steel? I built that, not just with money, but with my bare hands and my wife's brilliant mind. Today, I can't even afford a cup of coffee in its lobby. This isn't a story about a bad investment or a market crash. This is the story of how the woman who helped me build an empire was the one who signed its demolition order. My wife. My name is Clayton, and this is how I earned and lost everything. It all started with the smell of sawdust. Before the Italian suits and the corner office on the 50th floor, my cologne was wood shavings and sweat. I was a carpenter, a good one, mind you. I could build you a house from the ground up with nothing but a set of blueprints and a steady hand. My hands were calloused, but not from counting money. They were calloused from swinging a hammer, from shaping wood, from creating something real and solid where there was nothing before. I was proud of my work, but my ambition had a ceiling, a literal one. I built things for other people, for their dreams. I hadn't yet learned how to build my own. And then I met Eleanor. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever known. I met her on a job site. I was framing a custom home, and she was the young architect fresh out of school sent to inspect the progress. She walked through the skeleton of that house with a look in her eyes I'll never forget. I saw studs and support beams. She saw light and flow and life. She saw the geometry of a dream. She pointed out a subtle flaw in the blueprints, a way to open up the kitchen to the morning sun that the senior architect had missed. She was quiet, but her mind was loud and brilliant. We fell in love over blueprints and coffee and styrofoam cups. We didn't have much. Our first dates were walking through neighborhoods, not the nice ones, but the forgotten ones. The ones with boarded-up windows and overgrown lawns. While other couples went to the movies, we'd stand on a cracked sidewalk and she'd point at a dilapidated Victorian house, peeling paint and a sagging porch, and she described to me exactly how we could bring it back to life. She'd paint a picture with her words, and I, for the first time, could see it too. We got married a year later. A small ceremony, a cheap ring, but a bond forged in shared ambition. We were a team, a perfect one. She had the vision, I had the skill to make it real. Our big break, if you can call it that, came from a house that everyone else had written off. It was a tiny bungalow in a part of town that was considered a dead end. It had been on the market for over a year. It was a wreck. Water damage, a leaky roof, foundations that looked questionable. But Eleanor walked through it once, and her eyes lit up. "The bones are good, Clay," she told me. "The bones are good." We scraped together every penny we had. We emptied our savings account, took out a small high-interest loan from a lender who looked at us like we were insane, and we bought that disaster. For the next 6 months, that house was our entire world. I quit my carpentry job to work on it full-time from sunup to sundown. Eleanor would come straight from her firm every evening, still in her work clothes, and help me. She'd be ripping out old drywall or sanding floors right alongside me. She redesigned the entire interior, knocking down walls I thought were essential, creating an open-plan living space that nobody in that neighborhood had ever seen before. There were moments of pure despair. Nights we'd sit on the dusty floor, eating cheap pizza out of a box, wondering if we'd made the biggest mistake of our lives. The budget was a ghost that haunted us. Every nail, every can of paint was accounted for. We sacrificed everything. No nights out, no new clothes, nothing. Our youth and our energy were poured directly into the floors and walls of that little house. It was us against the world, and that house was our battlefield. Finally, it was done. We put a for sale sign on the perfectly manicured lawn, a lawn that was nothing but weeds 6 months earlier. The house was unrecognizable. It was a jewel. Eleanor's design was masterful. It felt twice as big as it was, flooded with natural light. The first open house, we were terrified no one would come. But they did. A young couple walked in and I watched their faces. I saw the same wonder in their eyes that I saw in Eleanor's when she first envisioned it. They made an offer that day for more than double what we had paid and invested. I remember the moment the check cleared. We were sitting in our tiny rental apartment looking at the number in our bank account. It wasn't a life-changing fortune, not by the standards I'd later come to know. But it was more money than either of us had ever seen. It was freedom. It was vindication. It was the most profound, the purest feeling of success I have ever known. It wasn't just profit. It was proof that our formula worked, proof that we could build our own dream. That first win, it's the purest feeling of success I've ever known. It was the spark that lit the whole fire. And if you're just starting your own journey, or you simply love a good story about how things begin, please do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know, and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. That first check was our seed money. We didn't celebrate by going on vacation. We immediately rolled it into the next project, a slightly bigger house in a slightly better neighborhood. We did it again and again. One house became two became four became a small 8-unit apartment building. We formalized it. We created a company, C&E Properties, Clayton and Eleanor, our names on the letterhead. It felt monumental. My role began to change. I spent less time swinging a hammer and more time shaking hands. I discovered I had a knack for negotiation, for finding undervalued properties, for convincing bankers to take a chance on us. Helena, meanwhile, was the soul of the company. She was our quality control, our strategist, our visionary. Every property C&E touched had her mark of intelligence and elegance on it. We were relentless, we were focused, we were hungry. People started to notice. We were the young, dynamic duo changing the face of real estate in the city. I remember the day we closed the deal on our first commercial property. It was an old, abandoned warehouse district by the waterfront. Everyone saw urban decay. Eleanor saw luxury lofts, restaurants, and a thriving community. It was a massive undertaking, a huge leap of faith that required millions in financing. I spent months putting that deal together, negotiating with a dozen different stakeholders. The day we signed the final papers, Eleanor and I went down to the waterfront and just stood there, looking at the decaying brick buildings. I wasn't a carpenter anymore. I was a developer, a builder of things far bigger than houses. I put my arm around her and I felt like a king with his queen surveying our future kingdom. We were still a team. We were still us against the world. And in that moment, I believed, truly believed, that as long as I had Eleanor by my side, I was invincible. And that, my friends, that's the irony. Believing you're invincible is the first crack in the foundation of any empire. The waterfront district wasn't just a success. It was a supernova. It didn't just put C&E Properties on the map. It redrew the map and put our name in the center, in bold gold leaf letters. The money that poured in was unlike anything I had ever imagined. It wasn't just house-flipping profit anymore. This was generational wealth, the kind of capital that reshapes skylines, and it reshaped me along with it. The calloused carpenter who fell in love with an architect over dusty blueprints began to fade, replaced by a man I barely recognized in the mirror of my new custom-tailored Italian suits. Life became a blur of opulence. We moved out of our comfortable but modest home into a sprawling mansion carved into a hillside, a fortress of glass and marble that overlooked the city I now considered my personal kingdom. I started a collection of classic cars, each one a gleaming trophy of my success, housed in a climate-controlled garage larger than our first home. We had a full-time staff, a chef, a housekeeper, a gardener. Eleanor no longer had to lift a finger, which I, in my naivety, saw as a gift. I thought I was freeing her from the work, not realizing I was slowly removing her from the very foundation of what we had built together. Our world, once a partnership of two, was now populated by sycophants and subordinates. The hungry, focused team of us against the world was replaced by me at the top of the world. The intimate dinners where we'd sketch ideas on napkins were replaced by lavish parties. Our home became a hub for the city's elite, politicians, bankers, socialites, all of them orbiting me, laughing at my jokes, nodding at my opinions, their faces reflecting the golden glow of my success. They weren't my friends. They were admirers of the money. But I was too drunk on the champagne and the validation to see the difference. Eleanor was gracious through it all, a perfect hostess. But I could see a distance growing in her eyes. In the quiet moments, after the last guest had departed and the silence of our cavernous house descended, I'd see a flicker of the woman I fell in love with, the one who saw beauty in broken things. She seemed lost in this palace of perfect things. We had everything we had ever dreamed of. And yet we had never been further apart. The language we spoke was no longer of shared dreams, but of schedules and social obligations. The first real crack in our foundation appeared disguised as a golden opportunity. A prime piece of real estate came up for sale in the most exclusive part of the city. My new circle of advisors, slick, fast-talking men who smelled of expensive cologne and risk, were all buzzing about it. Their idea was a hyper-luxury residential tower, a monument of exclusivity, with units selling for astronomical prices. They called the project the Elysian. When I brought the proposal to Eleanor, I expected her to be thrilled. I laid the plans out on our massive marble kitchen island. Her reaction was not what I anticipated. She was quiet, studying the market analysis, the financial projections. She traced the lines of the projected debt we'd have to take on. Finally, she looked up at me, and her expression wasn't excitement. It was deep, profound concern. "Clay," she said, her voice soft but firm, "this is too much. The market for this kind of luxury is paper-thin. It's saturated. We'd have to leverage almost everything we own to finance this. One downturn, one hesitation from buyers, and we could lose it all." I laughed. It was a dismissive, arrogant sound that I can still hear in my nightmares. "Honey, you're thinking like a small-time architect. We're in a different league now. This isn't about flipping a bungalow. This is about making a statement. This is legacy. Our legacy is the portfolio of smart, stable investments we built together," she countered, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't smart. It's ego. It's gambling, Clayton. We're developers, not gamblers." That stung, because she was right. But a man who believes he has a golden touch doesn't want to hear about risk. He only wants to hear the applause. I patted her hand, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but was in fact profoundly condescending. "Eleanor, you're the heart of this company. You make everything beautiful. You handle the design, the aesthetics. Leave the numbers and the risk assessment to me. I know what I'm doing." The words hung in the air between us, cold and heavy. For the first time, I had drawn a line in our partnership. I had relegated her to the creative department, while I, the genius, handled the real business. I had taken the we and cleaved it in two, into you and me. She looked at me, and I saw a flicker of hurt in her eyes that I chose to ignore. She didn't argue further. She just slid the plans back across the island and walked away. Her silence was more damning than any argument. I pushed the deal for the Elysian through. I didn't need her signature on every document anymore. The company was structured in a way that my authority was absolute on financial matters, a detail a younger, more collaborative me had never imagined using against her. I assembled my team of yes men, the bankers who saw fat commissions, the lawyers who saw billable hours, and we broke ground. The project became my obsession. I was on site every day, not with a hammer, but with a hard hat for photo ops. The media loved it. They called me a visionary, a titan of industry. And with every headline, every fawning article, my ego swelled. I was proving Eleanor wrong. I was proving I was more than just a carpenter who got lucky. I was a king, building his castle. The construction was a dream. We were ahead of schedule and under budget. The pre-sales for the units went through the roof, fueled by a frothy market and the sheer hype surrounding the project. Foreign investors and local celebrities were lining up to buy a piece of the Elysian before a single window had been installed. It was a phenomenon. The night of the topping-out party, when the final steel beam was hoisted to the pinnacle of the structure, I stood on a temporary balcony 50 stories high. The city lights spread out beneath me like a carpet of diamonds. Eleanor was by my side, beautiful and elegant, playing her part. I was insufferable, overflowing with triumph. I turned to her, a glass of champagne in my hand, and said, "See, I told you, sometimes you have to take the big risks. This building will be our greatest achievement." She just looked out at the city, her expression unreadable. "It's a beautiful building, Clay," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "I hope it's worth the price." I thought she was talking about the money. I was too blind to understand she was talking about us. The Elysian was completed to thunderous applause. It was a masterpiece of architecture and a staggering financial success. It nearly doubled my net worth overnight. The very gamble Eleanor had warned me against had paid off spectacularly. And that success was the worst thing that could have ever happened to me, because it didn't just fill my bank account, it filled my head with a fatal poison. It confirmed my belief that I was a genius, that my gut was infallible, and that her caution, the very thing that had been our guiding principle for years, was a weakness. I had won the argument. I had proven her wrong. Looking back now, I can see that moment for what it was. It wasn't a victory. It was the moment I stopped listening to the only person in the world who would tell me the truth. I had dismissed my partner, my conscience, my queen. And in my arrogance, I had just crowned myself the king of a kingdom that was already starting to crumble from within. The success of the Elysian should have been a moment for celebration, for consolidation. A sane man would have taken the profits, paid down debt and secured his empire for generations. But I was no longer a sane man. I was a king who had won a great battle and now craved a war to define his reign. The adulation was a drug, and I had become a desperate addict. My hunger was no longer for wealth, but for significance. I wanted to build something that would outlast me, something that would carve my name into the very fabric of the sky. The distance between Eleanor and me became a silent, unbridgeable chasm. We were living parallel lives under the same colossal roof. Our conversations were stripped of all warmth, reduced to logistical exchanges about which charity gala to attend or when the jet needed to be ready for a trip to St. Bart's. We ate at opposite ends of a dining table so long it felt like we needed binoculars to see each other. The clinking of our silverware on the porcelain was the only sound, a miserable symphony of our estrangement. I'd look at her, this brilliant, beautiful woman who had been my entire world, and see a stranger. A disappointed stranger. I filled the silence with noise. I worked relentlessly, not out of necessity, but to avoid the echoing emptiness of my own home. My circle of friends grew, a parasitic ecosystem of brokers, bankers, and lawyers who thrived on my ambition because it fed their own. They were my echo chamber, reflecting my own perceived brilliance back at me, amplifying my worst instincts. It was in one of these late-night brainstorming sessions, fueled by single malt scotch and testosterone, that the idea was born, the idea that would become my legacy and my undoing. It was a piece of land right in the heart of the financial district, a notoriously difficult plot, wedged between two historic buildings, with complex zoning laws and challenging bedrock. Several major developers had tried and failed to build there, losing millions in the process. The lot was considered cursed, a graveyard of ambition, and my acolytes presented it to me as the ultimate challenge. "Only a visionary like you, Clay, could make this work," one of them said, his eyes gleaming. Imagine it. The tallest structure in the city, a new pinnacle for the skyline. They didn't have to say another word. The vision ignited in my mind, fully formed and blinding. It wouldn't just be a building, it would be a testament to my power, a middle finger to gravity and to every person who had ever doubted me. It would be my monument, and it would have my name on it, the Clayton Tower. This time I didn't even pretend to collaborate with Eleanor. I had my teams run the numbers, create the renderings and secure the preliminary financing before I even mentioned it to her. I treated her not as my co-founder, but as a board member to be informed. I invited her to my home office one evening, the room panelled in dark mahogany, feeling more like a CEO than a husband. I unveiled the scale model like a magician revealing his greatest trick. She walked around it, her face a mask of cold appraisal. She didn't look at the elegant spire or the glistening facade. She looked at the base, at the foundation. She ran her fingers over the miniature representations of the surrounding historic buildings. Then she turned to the binder of financial projections I had prepared. She flipped through the pages for nearly 20 minutes in complete silence. The only sound was the rustle of paper. Finally, she closed the binder with a soft thud. "No," she said. It was a single, quiet, unshakable word. "No? What do you mean, no?" I stammered, taken aback by the bluntness of her refusal. "I mean no, Clayton. The answer is no," she repeated, looking me directly in the eye. Her gaze was clear and hard as diamond. "This isn't a business plan. This is a suicide note written on corporate letterhead. The debt load is catastrophic. You're projecting rental incomes that are pure fantasy, based on a market that's already showing signs of cooling. You're planning to finance this by cross-collateralizing nearly every stable, income-producing asset we own. You're taking our entire empire, everything we built, from the first bungalow to the waterfront lofts, and you're betting it all on this one single hubristic roll of the dice. She wasn't just concerned this time, she was furious. She slid a spreadsheet across the desk that her own analyst had prepared. Look at this. This is the reality. This is what happens if interest rates go up by 0.5 point. This is what happens if commercial occupancy drops by 5%. We don't just lose money, Clay. We are annihilated. We go to zero. Everything. Gone. I waved my hand, dismissing her data, her logic, her lifetime of expertise. These are just numbers, Eleanor. They don't account for vision, for momentum. I can make this happen. You have to have faith. And that's when she broke. The cool, controlled facade crumbled, and I saw a flash of the passionate woman I had once known. Faith. This has nothing to do with faith. This is about your insatiable ego. You don't want to build a building. You want to build a statue of yourself and force the entire city to look at it. You've stopped listening to anyone who doesn't tell you you're a genius. You've surrounded yourself with leeches who are telling you to jump off a cliff because they know you're wearing a golden parachute, and they don't care that the rest of us will be smashed on the rocks below. The argument escalated into the worst fight of our marriage. Voices were raised. Words were thrown like daggers intended to wound. I accused her of being timid, of having lost her nerve, of wanting to hold me back. She accused me of becoming a monster, a man so blinded by the reflection of his own success that he could no longer see the people he was trampling, starting with her. It ended in a terrible, heavy silence. She stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, her back to me. Her shoulders were shaking slightly. Then she turned, and her eyes were filled with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. Do you remember our first house, Clayton? When we'd sit on the floor and share a sandwich and dream about the future. All we wanted was to build good things and have a good life together. We achieved that a long, long time ago. Everything since has just been more. This tower, she gestured toward the model. This isn't a dream. It's a nightmare. She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the knob. She delivered the final prophetic blow. You don't see it, do you, Clayton? You'll get your monument, but it will cast a shadow over everything we ever built together, over our entire life. She left, and the door clicked shut behind her, a sound that echoed the finality of a coffin lid closing. I stood there for a long time alone in my grand office, the model of my tower gleaming under the spotlights. Her words had hit their mark. For a fleeting second, I felt a tremor of doubt, a cold dread that she was right. But then the pride, the stubborn, ruinous pride, rose up and crushed it. I would not be defied. I would not be proven wrong again. I would show her. I would show them all. The next day, I called an emergency board meeting. It was a formality. I held the controlling interest. I pushed the project through, steamrolling the few timid objections with sheer force of will. That evening, I sat alone at my desk, the final financing agreement spread before me. It was a stack of paper nearly a foot high, representing a debt so vast it was almost an abstract concept. I picked up the heavy, expensive pen. I saw the line at the bottom of the page, C&E Properties, LLC. For 15 years, every major document had borne two signatures, mine and hers, a partnership. Tonight there was only one space for me. As I pressed the nib to the paper, I knew I wasn't just signing a loan agreement. I was signing the death certificate of my marriage. I was signing away the last piece of the man who smelled of sawdust and dreamed with his wife on a dusty floor. I scrawled my name. The ink was black and final. It was the first shovelful of dirt in the grave of our marriage. Breaking ground on the Clayton Tower was like declaring war on reality itself. The project immediately began to fight back with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. My vision, so pristine and perfect in the architectural renderings, collided with the stubborn, messy truth of the physical world. We were barely a month into the excavation when we hit a massive, uncharted granite shelf. The geological surveys had missed it entirely. Blasting would risk the foundations of the two adjacent historic buildings. Our only option was to bring in specialized diamond-tipped drills that had to be shipped from Germany, operating around the clock, grinding away at the stone and my budget with equal agonizing slowness. The project, which had been a source of immense pride, transformed into a ravenous beast, consuming money, time, and every ounce of my psychic energy. The initial 3-month delay from the granite problem was just the overture to a symphony of disasters. An unseasonably wet spring turned the site into a mud pit, further stalling progress. Then came the whispers of a union strike, which soon escalated into a full-blown walkout. I, the former carpenter who once stood with these men, was now the pinstriped enemy on the other side of a negotiating table, forced to sign away millions in concessions just to get the cranes moving again. With each new crisis, the numbers on the spreadsheets grew more terrifying. The project was hemorrhaging cash. The meticulous financial projections I had once brandished like a weapon were now a source of constant mockery. I was living on a diet of stale coffee and rising panic. I'd wake up in the dead of night, my heart hammering against my ribs, the weight of 100,000 tons of concrete and steel pressing down on me, and the house, our beautiful cold mansion, became a mausoleum. The silence within its walls was a heavier burden than the roar of the construction site. I'd come home late, smelling of stress and city grit, and find Eleanor in the library or the garden, worlds away from me. We no longer fought. The passion required for a real argument had long since evaporated, leaving behind only the cold residue of resentment. Our interactions were clipped, brittle exchanges that could shatter at the slightest pressure. I remember one evening distinctly. I came home later than usual, having just been savaged in a meeting with the bankers who were growing nervous about the ever-expanding budget. I found Eleanor in the dining room, a single-place setting at her end of the immense table. She had already eaten. "There's a plate for you in the warming drawer," she said, not looking up from her book. "You couldn't wait," I snapped, the words sharper than I intended. She finally raised her eyes to meet mine. They were devoid of emotion. "I waited for 2 hours, Clayton. I've been waiting for years. I'm done waiting." The accusation in her simple statement was so profound, so devastatingly accurate, that I had no defense. All I had was attack. "You know, it would be nice to get a little support," I snarled. "It would be nice to come home to a wife who's on my team, instead of one who's sitting on the sidelines, just waiting for me to fail." She closed her book with a soft, deliberate motion. "That's where you're wrong," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am not waiting for you to fail. I am watching it happen. There is a fundamental difference. Waiting implies hope. Watching is just bearing witness to the inevitable." She stood up and walked out, leaving me alone in that ridiculously large room, my anger deflating into a hollow, miserable ache. She wasn't my adversary. She was an observer to a tragedy she had predicted, a tragedy in which I had cast myself as the lead. Her prediction about the market began to materialize in subtle, creeping ways. A major corporation announced they were shelving plans for a new regional headquarters. A competing luxury condo tower, one that had launched a year before mine, began quietly offering buyer incentives, a euphemism for slashing prices. I dismissed these as isolated tremors, refusing to acknowledge the tectonic plates of the economy were shifting beneath my feet. To admit she was right about the market would be to admit she was right about everything. My pride wouldn't allow it. Eleanor began to disappear, not just emotionally but physically. I started coming home to find she wasn't there at all. At first, it was for a night, then for a weekend. I eventually learned from the housekeeper that she had been spending more and more time at the small lake house we had bought in our early years. It was a rustic, humble place, the second property we had ever owned. It was the antithesis of the mansion. It was a remnant of a life where our ambitions were smaller and our happiness was bigger. Her retreat to that house was a clear and deliberate statement. She was returning to the version of our life that I had abandoned. She was seeking refuge in the past because the present I had constructed was unbearable. I should have seen it as an invitation, as a lifeline. I should have driven up there, parked my expensive car, and walked through that door to find the man I used to be. But I couldn't. To go to her would have been an act of surrender, and kings do not surrender. So I let her go. I let the silence of the mansion swallow me whole. I'd walk through the echoing marble halls, past rooms filled with priceless art and furniture, and feel nothing but a crushing, suffocating loneliness. I was celebrated at industry events. My face was on magazine covers. I was the man who was building the sky itself. But I was profoundly, utterly alone. I had 1,000 acquaintances and not a single friend. The only person whose opinion had ever truly mattered was living in a different world, a world I was no longer welcome in. The final day began like any other in that nightmarish period. A frantic call from my site foreman about a critical shipment of custom glass panels being delayed in customs. A tense conference call with the lenders, their voices thick with thinly veiled threats. The stock market had taken a sharp dip that morning, and the financial news was filled with talk of a correction. The word sent a bolt of ice through my veins. I drove home that evening feeling like an old man, utterly beaten down. I pulled into the long, winding driveway of the mansion. The house was lit up as always, but it looked like a museum after closing time. Grand, impressive, and completely devoid of life. I walked through the massive front doors into the cavernous foyer, and he was there. A man I had never seen before was standing by the grand staircase, as if he were waiting for me. He was in his 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal grey suit and holding a slim leather briefcase. He had the calm, impassive face of a man who was paid to be immune to emotion. He turned as I entered. "Mr. Vance?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Yes, who are you?" I asked, my mind still churning with thoughts of concrete and interest rates. I assumed he was another lawyer from the bank, sent to deliver more bad news in person. "My name is a matter of record. I am here on behalf of Mrs. Eleanor Vance." The formal use of her name stopped me cold. Not your wife. Not Eleanor. Mrs. Eleanor Vance. It was the language of strangers, of adversaries. A knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. He stepped forward and extended the briefcase. He unlatched it with a pair of precise clicks and took out a single, thick, manila envelope. He held it out to me. My hand trembled slightly as I took it. It felt impossibly heavy. "What is this?" I asked, though a part of me, a deep, primal part, already knew. "It's a petition, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice unchanging. "I believe you'll find it self-explanatory." I tore the flap of the envelope. My fingers fumbled with the sheaf of papers inside. I pulled them out, and my eyes scanned the dense legal text until they landed on the title at the top of the first page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. In that instant, the world went silent. The crippling debt of the tower, the looming market crash, the frantic calls from the bankers, all of it faded into an insignificant hum. That single piece of paper in my hand was more real, more catastrophic than any financial disaster. The foundation of my world wasn't the bedrock beneath my tower. It was her, and she had just served me with the demolition order. My empire wasn't just a financial construct, it was the life we had built, and it had just been condemned. By this point, the disaster was already written. All that was left was for the ink to dry. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because you are about to witness the demolition. And tell me in the comments, what do you believe was my single greatest mistake so far? Was it the arrogance that came after the Elysian? Was it the moment I chose to ignore Eleanor? Or was it the decision to build the tower itself? Let's discuss it. The legal papers felt like a block of ice in my hand, numbing me from the inside out. For a day I walked through my life in a fog of disbelief. The crisis at the tower, the storm clouds gathering over the economy, they all seemed like distant, trivial problems. My war wasn't with bankers or unions anymore. My war was about to be fought in a courtroom, against the one person who knew all my secrets, all my strengths, and most critically all of my weaknesses. I was a general preparing for a two-front war, not realizing that one of those fronts was inside my own command tent. The opening salvo was fired not with anger, but with cold surgical precision. Eleanor's legal team wasn't a small-town divorce practice. She had hired the most feared corporate litigators in the state. They weren't interested in alimony. They were interested in the meticulous dismemberment of C&E properties. They filed motions that froze our major assets, arguing quite correctly that the company's founder and visionary had a 50% claim to everything and that the primary shareholder, me, was engaging in reckless behavior that jeopardized the marital estate. Their forensic accountants swarmed my offices like a plague. These weren't the friendly auditors I schmoozed on the golf course. These were humorless men and women with ice water in their veins who moved through my financial records with predatory efficiency. They demanded every contract, every ledger, every email. And they found exactly what Eleanor knew they would find: the spiderweb of cross-collateralization I had spun to finance the Clayton Tower. They saw that I had pledged our most stable, profitable properties as security against the monumental gamble in the financial district. They laid it all out in a devastatingly clear report. The entire empire was a house of cards, with the tower as its wobbling foundation. And then, the world outside decided to kick the table. The market didn't just correct, it plunged. It was a Black Thursday, a day of pure, unadulterated panic on Wall Street. The kind of day that gets a name and is spoken about in hushed, fearful tones for decades to come. The financial news channels, which had once celebrated me as a titan, now showed graphs that were vertical red lines, charting the catastrophic descent. The high-end luxury market, the very air I was breathing to keep my tower afloat, evaporated in a single afternoon. It didn't soften, it vanished. The next morning the call came. It was from the lead banker at the consortium that had financed the tower. His voice, once warm and sycophantic, was now a flat, metallic instrument of doom. There was no preamble. "Clayton, we have a problem. Given the current market volatility and the reassessed value of your collateral, you're facing a significant margin call." I felt the blood drain from my face. How significant? I could hear him shuffling papers. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, you will need to deposit $95 million to bring your loan-to-value ratio back into compliance." $95 million. The number was so absurd, it was almost laughable. I might as well have tried to conjure it out of thin air. "That's impossible," I whispered. "You know our assets are frozen by the court." "That is your problem, not ours," he said, the false sympathy in his voice more insulting than open hostility. "You have 48 hours, Clayton, or we initiate foreclosure proceedings." He hung up. 48 hours. I was a condemned man who had just been told the exact time of his execution. What followed was a cascade of pure, terrifying chaos. I was trapped in a perfect storm of my own making. I couldn't access capital because of the court order. The value of the very assets I needed to leverage was plummeting by the hour. My lawyers were in emergency session with Eleanor's team, but her litigators smelled blood in the water. They argued to the judge that my impending default on the tower loan proved their entire case. I was a reckless fiduciary, and the only way to protect Eleanor's share of the estate was to force an immediate, court-supervised liquidation of all assets. The judge agreed. The word liquidation sounds so clean, so sterile. The reality is a violent, brutal affair. It's the corporate equivalent of being torn apart by wolves. The dismantling of C&E properties began. My best buildings, the ones that were the lifeblood of our cash flow, were put on the auction block in the worst real estate market in a generation. Buyers, circling like vultures, picked them up for 30 cents on the dollar. The waterfront district, our crown jewel, the project that had made us, was sold to a faceless hedge fund from Dubai. I saw a news photo of them prying the C&E Properties sign off the main building with a crowbar. It felt like they were prying out my ribs. Then came the personal indignities. The court-appointed receiver arrived at the mansion with a team of appraisers. They walked through my home, my life, putting little green stickers on everything of value: the classic cars, the art collection, the wine cellar, even Eleanor's grand piano in the music room. It was all inventoried, catalogued, and scheduled for auction. My friends vanished like mist in the morning sun. The phone, which once never stopped ringing with invitations and deal proposals, fell silent. The few calls I tried to make went to voicemail. Men who had drunk my best scotch and begged me for investments now instructed their secretaries to tell me they were in a meeting. I had never understood the true definition of being a pariah until then. I was radioactive. The day of the estate auction was the nadir of my humiliation. I didn't go, but I saw the pictures online. Strangers wandering through my home, picking up my possessions, inspecting them, haggling over the price of my life. A tech billionaire, a kid half my age, bought my favorite Ferrari. A rival's wife bought the necklace I had given Eleanor for our 10th anniversary. The money raised from the fire sale was a pittance. It was enough to satisfy the banks on the foreclosed tower, which was sold unfinished to a rival developer who promptly and publicly announced he was renaming it, and to pay the mountain of legal fees. What was left was split. Eleanor walked away with a few $1,000,000, a fraction of what she deserved, but enough to live comfortably. I was left with the scraps, less than scraps. After all the creditors were paid, after the lawyers took their ruinous cuts, I was left with a final check. I remember staring at it. $5,212. The final act was walking out of the mansion. The new owners had given me 24 hours to clear out my personal effects. I didn't have much. I packed one suitcase with some clothes, a few old photographs from before the money, and the tarnished silver hammer my father had given me when I started as a carpenter. I walked through the echoing, empty rooms one last time. The ghosts of laughter and bitter arguments seemed to cling to the air. As I stood in the marble foyer, ready to close the massive door behind me for the last time, I saw my reflection in the polished surface. I didn't see a titan of industry. I didn't see a king. I saw a tired, broken old man in a wrinkled suit holding a single suitcase. In the span of 6 months, I had gone from a $500,000,000 empire to a bank account that wouldn't cover 2 months' rent in one of my old buildings. I had lost the company, the fortune, the homes, the cars, the status, but the most profound loss had happened long before. Standing there, with the door to my empty palace closing behind me with a definitive hollow boom, I was completely, utterly alone. The fall is a sudden, violent event, a plummet from a great height. But the landing, the aftermath, that's a slow, grinding process. The first year after losing everything was a study in grey. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a part of town I used to fly over in my helicopter, a neighborhood with sirens for a lullaby and the smell of exhaust fumes in the air. The silence was the most deafening part. There were no assistants to field calls, no housekeepers to tidy up, no gardeners to manicure the scenery. There was just me, the 4 walls, and the deafening echo of my failure. For months, I was paralyzed by shame. I couldn't bring myself to look people in the eye. Every stranger on the street felt like a judge, their glance a verdict on my spectacular implosion. I'd see my old buildings downtown, one of them now bearing another man's name, and I'd feel a physical sickness in the pit of my stomach. The city I had once seen as my kingdom was now a constant towering reminder of everything I had lost. I drank, not for pleasure, but for oblivion. I spent most of those $5,000 on cheap whiskey that burned all the way down, hoping it would incinerate the memories along with my throat. The bottom wasn't a single event. It was a slow scraping along the jagged floor of despair. It came to a head one miserable rainy Tuesday. I was out of money, out of whiskey, and out of excuses. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. I caught my reflection in a darkened storefront window, a gaunt, unshaven stranger with haunted eyes and a tremor in his hands. That man wasn't a failed tycoon, he was a ghost. And in that moment, something inside me, a tiny, resilient flicker of the carpenter I once was, decided it was better to build a hovel than to haunt a ruin. That was the beginning of the climb, not back to riches, but back to dignity. It was the most difficult construction project of my life. The first step was a lesson in abject humility. I needed a job. My name, once my greatest asset, was now toxic. No one in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate would touch me. Finally, I swallowed what was left of my pride and called a man named Sal, who ran a small residential construction firm. I had known him years ago. He used to be one of my subcontractors. I asked him for a job, any job. He was silent on the other end of the line for a long time. I was sure he was about to hang up. Instead, he said, "Be at the site on Elm Street tomorrow, 6 a.m., don't be late." The next morning, I showed up. Sal handed me a tool belt and a hard hat. He didn't put me in the office. He put me on a framing crew. I was 60 years old, standing alongside kids in their 20s, my hands, which had grown soft from years of signing checks, now gripping a nail gun. The work was brutal. My body screamed in protest. Every muscle ached. But with every nail I drove, with every wall I helped raise, I felt a piece of myself being rebuilt. The smell of sawdust was no longer the smell of my past. it was the smell of my penance. I learned more in those first few months working for Sal than I had in the 10 years I spent at the top of my ivory tower. I learned about camaraderie. The young men on the crew didn't care about my past. They cared if I could hold my own, if I showed up on time, if I did the work without complaining. I learned about the quiet satisfaction of a day's physical labor, of being tired in my bones, not just in my soul. I rediscovered the simple, profound joy of creating something real and tangible with my own 2 hands. Slowly, I began to piece a new life together, a smaller life, but a more authentic one. I reconnected with my younger brother, a high school teacher I had patronized and largely ignored during my reign. I had sent him extravagant gifts for Christmas, but had never bothered to call him on his birthday. When I finally reached out, broken and ashamed, he didn't say, "I told you so." He just said, "It's about time I miss my big brother." We met for coffee. We didn't talk about money or buildings. We talked about baseball, about our childhood, about his kids. At the end of our meeting, he slipped a $100 bill into my coat pocket. It was the most generous gift I had ever received. I found a new kind of wealth, one that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. It was in the quiet evenings spent reading a library book instead of a stock market report. It was in the taste of a simple meal I had cooked for myself. It was in the genuine friendships I forged with the men on the crew, men who would share their lunch with me if I forgot mine. These were riches that couldn't be leveraged or lost in a market crash. The fundamental lesson I learned wasn't about finance or real estate. It was about identity. For 20 years, I had allowed my net worth to define my self-worth. I wasn't Clayton Vance, the man. I was Clayton Vance, the multimillionaire, the developer, the titan. When the money vanished, I thought I had vanished along with it. The great lesson of my fall was discovering what remained when all of that was stripped away. I had lost an empire, but in the rubble I found myself. About a year ago, I was sitting in a small independent coffee shop near my apartment. I was reading the newspaper when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, and she was there. Eleanor. She looked peaceful. The lines of stress and worry that I had etched onto her face were gone. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. For a heartbeat, the air was thick with history. I expected her to turn and walk out. Instead, she offered a small, hesitant smile and walked over to my table. "Clayton," she said. "Eleanor," I replied. We talked for almost 2 hours. It wasn't a conversation between bitter ex-spouses. It was like 2 old friends who had survived the same shipwreck, finally meeting on a distant shore. We didn't relitigate the past. We talked about the beginning, about that first dilapidated bungalow, about the feeling of turning that key in the lock for the first time. I apologized. Not for losing the money, but for losing my way, for forgetting the we. She told me she had started a small architectural consulting firm, specializing in historic preservation. She was happy, truly happy. There was no talk of reconciliation. Our story as a couple was long over. But in that small cafe we found something equally precious: closure and forgiveness. As I sit here today in my small apartment, I can still see that skyscraper from my window if I crane my neck just right. It no longer fills me with anger or regret. I see it for what it is: a monument, not to my success but to my hubris. A beautiful, empty symbol of a profoundly important lesson. My ego cost me my marriage, and losing my marriage revealed that my empire was just a collection of assets. My true wealth had been in the partnership, in the shared dream. The money was just a byproduct, a dangerous distraction that amplified my flaws until they consumed me. Today, I don't have an empire. I have a life. I have my brother back. I have friends who would give me the shirt off their back. I have the quiet pride of a job well done at the end of the day. And I have peace, a deep, abiding peace that no amount of money can buy and no market crash can ever take away. That is a richness beyond measure. If this story resonated with you, I ask you to share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And finally, leave a comment below and tell me the greatest lesson about money or life that you have ever learned. Thank you for listening.